Welcome to, I'd normally be saying welcome to Historic Flight Foundation, but while we're all sequestered in our hideouts, welcome to a resurrection of the second presentation that we made 5 years ago in the Battle of Britain's 75th anniversary. Of course, we're looking at the 80th anniversary right now, but this is our original presentation that we talked about. And what we'd like to do in this section is to talk about what some of us refer to as just-in-time fighters. And really, it was the early development of both the Hurricane and the Spitfire that was used by the Allies during World War II, but specifically during the Battle of Britain right at the beginning. So we want to talk about that early development, and that just kind of summarizes it. Really, Britain in 1939, 1940 was doing exactly the same as the rest of the world. They were recovering or trying to recover from the Great Depression. But meanwhile, Germany, in response to early developments after the Treaty of Versailles laid down the rules that they would follow following World War I, Germany was rearming. Hitler had been created Chancellor in 1933, and in October of that year, he took Germany out of the League of Nations, which, as you recall, was the organization that Woodrow Wilson, the American president, had required to be the first part of the Treaty of Versailles. Right about that October of 1933 time period, Winston Churchill got up in Parliament in London and warned that Germany was becoming the most heavily armed country in Europe, and it was getting ready for war. At that point, Britain started to look at their situation, and they started to look at really what might be required, because they'd been focused on the recovery from the Depression, and they had really neglected to finance and grow the various armed forces as a result of that time. Now, in order to, we'll take a look at the Hurricane first. And what I'd like to do here is introduce this guy, and I'm sure most of you at least know the name. Thomas Sopwith was quite famous as a producer and a pilot trainer during World War I. And at the end of World War I, he'd made quite a success of that time. He'd obviously designed a considerable number of airplanes that had been used by the Allies in World War I. And at the end of World War I, the grateful British government turned around and told him that they, in their consideration, he'd made excess profits during the war, and they wanted him to, he was accused of those making excess profits. Well, Tommy Sopwith was the son of a quite well-to-do family, and actually he grew up, he was the 8th member of a family. His middle name is Octave. He was the 8th member of the family, had seven sisters. He was the 8th child. He said it was growing up like growing up in a girls' school. But anyway, Tommy Sopwith immediately liquidated his company in 1919 after the First World War, and went back to his life as a member of the landed gentry. And but his employees, when he folded the company, had some different ideas. Primary in that group was this next man, Harry Hawker. Harry Hawker had emigrated with 2 other guys, both called Harry, from Australia in 1911. And he persuaded Tommy Sopwith to teach him to fly. And as soon as Sopwith experienced Hawker, he, as in flight, he realized that he was a natural. And from there on, Harry Hawker became Tommy Sopwith's demonstration and test pilot for the duration. After Tommy Sopwith folded the company, Harry and a bunch of his employees pooled whatever funds they had and formed Hawker Engineering Company in 1919. And everything went fine. What did Hawker Engineering do but make fighter airplanes for the Royal Air Force, primarily? Everything was fine until 1922. And in 1922, Harry Hawker experienced a brain hemorrhage in flight and was killed in the subsequent crash. And it didn't look very good for that company. However, all of the other employees got a hold of Tommy Sopwith and said, Tommy, how'd you like to come out of retirement and run Hawker Engineering and design and build airplanes again? And Tommy Sopwith did just that, and in fact ran the company for the next 54 years. Tommy Sopwith died at 101, and he saw every airplane from the Sopwith Pup all the way through the Hawker AV-8 Harrier, the jump jet. So he'd seen most of aviation history during that time period. But Tommy Sopwith was a big thinker. He was a visionary, but he was also he was the kind of guy who liked to surround himself with good pilots and good designers. And he did just that. And one of the first people he hired was this man right here in 1921, Sidney Cam. And by 1925, Sidney Cam became chief designer of Hawker Engineering. Well, it was then called Hawker Aircraft. And in 1926, right after he became chief designer, the British Air Ministry, which was the government organization that procured airplanes for the services, issued a specification for a light bomber. That was Air Ministry Spec 1226, I think. It was 1926, and the 12th spec they'd issued that year. They stuck to their original kind of ideas, which was to promote two-seat airplanes and promote biplanes only. The Air Ministry had a real thing about monoplanes. They'd had some unfortunate experience with monoplanes with wing failures, and they were very conscious of that. So Cam came on board, and he designed the response to that light day bomber, which was called the Hawker Heart. This is the Heart here. Took its first flight in June of 1928. It had a Rolls-Royce Kestrel V12 liquid-cooled engine, and was quite an embarrassment to the Air Force initially, because it wound up being 20 miles an hour faster than the Bristol Bulldog, which was at the time the fastest fighter in the inventory. So it didn't look good to have a light bomber that would travel faster than the airplanes that were supposed to catch it. But again, Tommy Sopwith, in a quiet way, got involved here. He was an industrialist, and he believed in the family plan. And he started designing and getting Cam to design variants of the Hawker Heart for Army cooperation, for the Navy, for the Royal Marines, and for the Royal Navy. And having done that, he finally wore down the Air Ministry and produced a single-seat airplane, still a biplane, but a single-seat airplane called the Hawker Fury. This was a 200-mile-an-hour airplane plus, and used the Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine again, and was regarded at the time as really the cream of the crop. And that airplane became quite well established. What happened then was that the Air Ministry, the Air Ministry issued another specification in 1934 for a single-seat airplane, an 8-gun monoplane, and they wanted a monoplane this time, so they got over their headaches about biplanes. They realized that monoplanes could fly fast. Sidney Cam took a look at that and said, wait a minute, I've already got a high-speed fighter. All I need to do is really enclose a cockpit, put a bigger engine in it, and that looks, just take the top wing off. And that looked very much like the idea that started the Hawker Hurricane. And that was the design he started with. He put a new 1650 cubic inch Rolls-Royce PV12 engine in it, which was the precursor of the Merlin, really, and enclosed the cockpit. But he was a believer in simplicity of design, particularly. And in doing that, there's just another transition picture between the two. You see the similarities between the airplanes. Here was the prototype in November of 1935, 5083, which doesn't look particularly well dressed there. It's obviously just bare structure. And that became the prototype that flew for the first time in November of 1935 from Brooklands, which is just southwest of London. And the guy who flew it was this man, George Bullman. Now, Bullman, when you look at him, you think, well, he'd make a pretty good pig farmer. But he was a very well-regarded test pilot at the time. He was the chief test pilot of Hawkers, and was known for his very well-presented demonstration flights. And he showed the Hurricane off for its good performance right off the bat. So, okay, let's take a look at how simple the minds were working. This is a picture of really what is just an extended version of the Hawker Fury fuselage structure. Tubular metal, tubular steel, and it was sitting on a center section box, if you like, which is, I think, there you go, of two spars, a front spar and a rear spar for the wing. But that was the major structure that the airplane had behind it. Now, that box in the middle was made up of a front and rear spar that was called a dumbbell spar. And this was Cam's design. And he produced it by taking rolled metal sheet. I said earlier that was a steel structure. It wasn't, it was aluminum, I beg your pardon. But you see from here, this is a rolled steel and riveted spar. And that formed the center section, or the center box, if you like, of the Hurricane structure. And the reason that Cam had done that was that he realized throughout the 30s, the British Royal Air Force had quite a lot of experience in the Middle East. And in the Middle East, it's not easy to maintain airplanes. And so you've got to keep them simple. And that was part of Cam's thinking. If you look at all the joints that are on that tie all of those tubes together in that structure, they're all bolted joints. And that was done for ease of maintenance. And then what he did, having got a basic metal structure, he then put wooden formers on there, bolted to that structure that formed the shape of the airplane. And this is the look at the inside, looking aft, of a Hawker Hurricane fuselage. You see the space frame there with those bolted joints at all of the joint points. You can see the control wires going through there. But then you see those wooden formers on the outside of the metal structure, and there are wooden longerons that are placed along there to join all those frames together, and then the whole lot is covered with doped fabric. And that was the formation of the Hurricane basic fuselage. Now, the Air Ministry had wanted a closed-in cockpit, and here's how Cam built the cockpit. You see again the metal framework, and then you see the wooden superstructure that's tied to that, which formed the enclosed cockpit of the Hurricane and gave it the well-known lines with the humpback. And you see all of the wooden structure that's up there that formed the whole airplane. Now, looking at the rest of the airplane, particularly the wing, to a structural engineer, particularly one with a front and rear spar, there's the rear spar and a rib. And if you look at the whole thing, a structural engineer just regards that as a beam. That beam takes the weight of the structure and of whatever's inside the wing. And it also takes the lifting loads and the twisting moments that are created by the control surface deflections. And so that kind of is another piece of the simplicity that Cam put in there. And what he did was to hang the landing gear from the outboard frames of the box structure that formed that center section with the dumbbell spar. And that gave a wide landing gear, which was very popular with the pilots because they were landing and taking off from grass fields that could get lumpy at times. You see the Hurricane up front, the Merlin up front, and there's the wing structure itself. You can see the front and rear spar. This is outboard of the center section. And right there, the Air Ministry had asked for 8 machine guns to be fitted into the wings, and Cam fitted those immediately outboard of that center section. So he had structural integrity there and simplicity, and that was the basis of the Hurricane wing. Those guns, by the way, were required by Air Ministry to fire outside of the propeller arc, because he didn't want to complicate the thing by having interrupter gear in the middle there. If we look at the engine mount was just basically the same as the Hawker Hart. Used a Merlin instead of a Kestrel, and that had the same mount points, basically having all been designed by the same team of guys, basically. And the airplane started to be delivered. This is in the beginning of 1938. And this is one of the first Hurricanes delivered to Kenley, just south of London. That was one of the sector stations in the Battle of Britain. And you see there a 2-bladed fixed wooden prop. That was the Watts prop, one of the first ones in there. And this was the first deliveries of the airplane. And they came from just the Hawker factory, and also another factory that Tommy Sopwith had bought called Gloucester's. And at the same time, he acquired Armstrong Siddeley Engines and Armstrong Whitworth Airplane Company, and put them all together in what became the Hawker Siddeley Group. And it was Tommy Sopwith who formed that Hawker Siddeley Group early on. Here were the deliveries. The first ones went to 111 Squadron, or Treble 1 Squadron it's known, at Northolt. That came in 1937. On that previous picture, by the way, the second guy from the left there is my father. Then a flight sergeant in the Air Force. He was commissioned right after the Battle of Britain. He'd done most of his foreign service at sea with the Fleet Air Arm in the early 30s. When he was called back to Britain in the 1936, they said, well, you've done your foreign service. We'll just put you in fighter command around London for the duration. That's where he wound up for all of the Battle of Britain. Mother and I were with him too. So I can claim to have gone through the Battle of Britain, but I was 2 years old, so I couldn't remember too much. But anyway, that's another story. But after these airplanes first got into service, it was obvious that they needed a refinement in the propeller control to give it better performance and reduce accidents that were caused by guys being in the wrong pitch for flying, for landing and taking off, and for flying fast. And that was brought about by a de Havilland and a Rotol. Rotol was a company formed by Rolls-Royce and Bristol, and de Havillands had all created a variable pitch propeller, and they also put armor on to protect the pilots on the Hurricane, and that was how the thing started service. In 1961, I was a student at what was then the Cranfield College of Aeronautics in Bedford, just north of London, and became Cranfield University in the end. And this is the last of the many. This is the last production Hurricane that was produced by Hawkers, and was looked after with loving care by a lot of very dedicated mechanics. And this was a picture that I took in 1961 at Cranfield, when Hugh Merriweather, who the Hawker test pilot, came over and lectured to us on flight tests. But after he finished, he gave us a flying display, the like of which I'd not seen before, and left cutting grass pretty well with the prop. But that airplane became known quite well as this PZ-865. It's a Hurricane 2C that was taken over by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, and in fact is still with them. This is the same airplane in its 2014 colors, which we understand are the 2020 colors. We haven't seen much of it this year for obvious reasons, but it's in the colors of 34 Squadron, which was a member of the Southeast Asian Command. And it's based with the rest of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Excuse me. At RAF Collingsby in Lincolnshire. Excuse me, let me just get up. It's better drying out. Okay, let's now take a look at the Supermarine Spitfire and where that came from. Again, that was a product of dedicated people, and no one less than this guy, Reginald Mitchell, or RJ as he was known in the trade. He came along to Supermarine aviation in 1917 as a 21-year-old. They're based just outside of Southampton in the south of England. And they produced flying boats and seaplanes. And in 1920, Mitchell had made a big enough impression on his management that he became the chief designer of the company. And in 1922, he succeeded in designing the winning entry for the 1922 Schneider Trophy race. Now, the Schneider Trophy was a race for a sprint race, really, for flying boats, which was initiated by a Frenchman, Paul Schneider, hence the name, obviously. And the Supermarine company had really set its sights on being able to do this for quite a long period. And 1922, Mitchell succeeded. However, 1923 came along and the American team turned up with a Curtiss CR-3 float plane. And it was powered by a V12 engine, 465 horsepower, and it was still 20 miles an hour faster than the Mitchell entry, which had a Napier Lion engine rated at about 550 horsepower. So people took a look at this, and really overnight, the character of the Schneider Trophy seaplane races changed. And it changed from flying boats to seaplanes. In other words, airplanes that were on floats and a lot lighter and a lot faster. And in 1925, by this time the Schneider Trophy races were being covered every 2 years. In 1925, the United States team won again with an uprated version of the Curtiss CR airplane, and again with the same engine. And the guy who won it in 1925 was none other than Jimmy Doolittle. And he was making quite a name for himself in the aviation business in the United States. Now, the next race in 1927 was obviously going to be quite a competitive exercise. But the United States government at the time said that they would no longer sponsor military pilots to fly in these races because it wanted to dedicate all of the resources of the US government towards developing commercial aviation. And that's precisely what they did. Nevertheless, Mitchell went along and said, "We got to do something. I've been using this Napier Lion 12-cylinder engine for long enough, and we need something more powerful." And he went along to see Henry Royce and said, "Okay, Henry, what can we do?" Royce took a look at his stable and said, "Well, the only engine we really got right now is about a 700 horsepower version of the Kestrel, which was the Hawker Hart airplane or engine." And he said, "But I'd like to get the company building something bigger." And Royce decided, there was one of the last major decisions that Henry Royce took before he retired, or before he died. He decided that he would get the company going in the direction of producing a nominal 1,000 horsepower engine, which of course became the Merlin in the end. And in order to satisfy Reginald Mitchell and also the progress that needed to be made in terms of development for the follow-on engines, Henry Royce put this man in charge. Ernest Hives had been, he'd been with Royce from day one pretty well. And you can see there from the chart the kind of progress that he made going through Rolls-Royce engineering. And he was the man who was assigned to designing this engine in the upper part of this picture, which was the Rolls-Royce R engine. R stood for racing engine. And Ernest Hives had quite a what shall I call it, an inspiring thought. Up until this point, the Kestrel engine, which was a V12 liquid-cooled engine, smaller version, had been using superchargers or a supercharger to restore sea level performance at higher altitude as it climbed out. And Royce thought, or at least Hives thought, look, the Schneider Trophy is a sprint race. It's something where I don't need longevity and I don't need endurance. I don't need, long-term life components. So why can't I use a supercharger to boost sea level performance as well as maintaining that performance to altitude? And he did just that. And they took a 37-liter or 2,450 cubic inch engine, which is the upper one here. And it developed in 1929, something like 1,900 horsepower. And really then he pulled all the stops out in 1931 for the winning entry to the Schneider Trophy race and produced 2,350 horsepower out of that engine. Now, Rolls-Royce took that engine to heart. It took them 10 years to create a version of that engine that could endure for a reasonable life. And that became the Griffin engine, which of course replaced the Merlin in some of the more advanced Spitfires later on in life. And down below that is an image of the nominal 1,000 horsepower. This one says 1,100. It was a PV12, and I'll explain that in a moment. And that was the engine that developed into the Merlin. And the Merlin started out as a nominal 1,000 horsepower engine, but by the end of World War II, it was developing over 2,500 horsepower, which is quite something for the durability of that engine. Anyway, here are the airplanes that were using that engine right up till the time. The top one here is the Supermarine S5 that won the 1927 Schneider Trophy race. That was the last version of this airplane that used the Lion engine. That engine was an engine that was a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine, but the cylinders were arranged in 3 banks of 4, and it was designated as a downward arrow engine, if you like. It was like a V8 with another bank of cylinders in the top. In 1929, the S6 came along, and that used the first version of the PV12, and then the S6B, oh sorry, not the PV12, it used the first version of the R engine, and then 1931, of course, used the final version of the R engine. Now, at the beginning of 1930, the Air Ministry decided that they wanted to issue a specification, which they did, F730 as it was called. This was a monoplane. They wanted 250 miles per hour out of it. And Reginald Mitchell designed the airplane you see on the left there, the Supermarine 224. It was a failure. It used the wrong engine, and it used a failed engine, really. One of the few engines that Rolls-Royce built that did fail, the Goshawk. But that competition was won in the end by the airplane on the right, the Gloucester Gladiator. But as you see, that's a greater single-seat airplane, but it's still a biplane, and was it had some degree of success, but it certainly wasn't anything that was needed for the upcoming conflict in World War II. In 1928, Supermarine had been taken over by Vickers of steel fame and of World War I machine gun fame and this kind of thing. And it was run by this man on the left, Sir Robert McLean. And McLean had been through the whole Supermarine 224 design development. And he was fed up to the back teeth of interference, as he looked at it, by the Air Ministry. He said, why on earth don't you leave the designers to design these airplanes and engines instead of trying to tell us how to do the job? And Arthur Seagrave he'd taken over Rolls-Royce after Henry Royce died. And the two of them said, look, let's get rid of the bureaucrats. Let's let our engineers design the engine and the airplane. And we'll do it without any financial interference from those guys either. And so he literally turned the guys loose, both at Rolls and at Supermarine, and said, I want you to build a killer fighter. And that basically was the birth of this, what became the Spitfire. And you see the note at the bottom there, it says that in no circumstances would technical members of the Air Ministry be consulted or allowed to interfere. That was being, pretty low-fog index language, pretty well for the time being. Anyway, here is the first design that was put together by Mitchell. And as you see, it doesn't have the classic Spitfire wing, but you can see similarities with the fuselage. That one developed into the Spitfire later on. But this was in 1934. In 1932, this man, Beverly Shenstone, a Canadian, had joined Supermarine, and he graduated as a graduate student in 1928 in Canada. And as soon as he graduated, he hightailed it to Germany and went to work for Junkers. And while he was there, he managed to meet up with Ludwig Prandtl and understood some of Ludwig Prandtl's aerodynamic theories and practices, and basically took the idea of elliptic wing platforms and modified those to go into the Spitfire design. Now, to say that the Spitfire design is elliptical, it's really a combination of two ellipses. The minor axis on the leading edge of the Spitfire is half that of the section at the rear end of the wing. But it nevertheless needed to be not only a specific shape, but also thin. And if you look at the others, I mean, the Hurricane's wing is about a 15% thickness to chord ratio. The chord is just the fore and aft distance of the wing. And the thickness, obviously, is the thickest part of the wing. The Hurricane is about 15%, whereas the Spitfire is a 13% thickness chord ratio at the root, and that tapers down to 6% at the tip. And if you get up close and personal with the tip of a Spitfire, you'll see how thin that really is. here's the actual profile of the wing that was used on the Spitfire, and we'll just talk a little bit about how that came about and what the characteristics of it are that really give a clue as to the secret of the Spitfire's wing. Now, here's a picture of the Spitfire, and one of the characteristics of a semi-elliptic wing is that if you take a section of that wing and the lifting force that that piece of the wing generates, and you multiply it by the distance between the aerodynamic center of that lift and the quarter chord point, that blue line across there indicates the 1/4 of the chord, or the fore and aft dimension of the wing. And if you take that lift force and the distance from the quarter chord point, it is essentially a constant. You multiply the two together, and it's essentially a constant pitching moment around that blue line, or that quarter chord point. That was very important because Alan Clifton, I beg your pardon, Alan Clifton, let's go back one. Alan Clifton, who was Reginald Mitchell's structural designer, realized that that characteristic would allow him to make a much lighter structural wing for the Spitfire, and I'll show you in a minute how that's done. Meanwhile, in 1937, in June, Reginald Mitchell had died of stomach cancer, and the baton in Supermarine passed to this man, Joe Smith. Joe Smith, in many ways, never really got into the full limelight, although he totally deserves it. He'd been chief draftsman under Mitchell, and he was made chief designer after Mitchell died. And, you know, with a name other than Joe Smith, he would have been well known. But Joe Smith, you know, there were so many Joe Smiths in the world that a lot of people had never heard of him. But he was a dedicated disciple of Reginald Mitchell and was responsible for the design development through all 24 marks of the Spitfire until the end of its career. And a man who deserves in many ways many of the accolades that Mitchell had, in that he developed an awful lot, obviously with help from the rest of the design team and the Rolls-Royce guys as well. But this was, that unique feature of the wing allowed Joe Smith, first of all, to develop the front spar of the wing. Now, if you look at the front spar here, it's two chords, top and bottom, with web plates to separate the two to form the structural spar of the wing. What Joe Smith did was created a series of interlocking tubes, if you like, which you see arrayed above that assembly there. There was a solid core at the top, and that went inside one tube and another and another and another. And you see the simple design principle that was continued. The inboard part with the highest loads on it were created by these concentric tubes in a completely square section. As you get further outboard, that square section was cut in half to create a U section, and you went further outboard on that, and at the tip, or just short of the tip, it was cut in half again to make a piece of angle iron. So in that respect, it was a simple piece of structure to put together. It was about the only simple thing in the whole wing. But that allowed Joe Smith and really Alan Clifton to create a wing that was totally different from anything that had come previous. Instead of, like the Hurricane wing, where the wing box was made up of the front and rear spar and the interconnecting ribs, this one, the structural integrity or the real strength in that wing is in the D section forward of the front spar. That loading characteristic of that wing meant that you could take all of the bending and torsional loads primarily through that D-section front torque box. And that left all of the real estate that you see behind that front spar for putting things like armament and wheels and landing gear, retraction mechanisms and that kind of thing. And it really made a lightweight structure. You can see how the rest of the wing there after that front spar is quite light. The fuselage was no exception. If you look here at the rear fuselage, the what's called semi-monocoque fuselage structure was made up of lightweight elliptic frames that were connected by 4.5 stringers and longerons, aluminum, and then the whole lot was covered with aluminum sheet. And so it was totally different from the structure that was used in the Hurricane, but nevertheless was a very efficient and very lightweight structure. You also see at the front end, forward of the cockpit, the fuel tank on this airplane. It's only 87 gallons imperial, and didn't give a lot of duration to this airplane, something just over an hour and a quarter, hour and 20 minutes, but nevertheless made quite a compact structure. The Merlin engine is up front, very much similar kind of structure to what had been put in the Hurricane, in as much as the engine was the same engine, the Merlin, and so it required a similar structure to that on the Hurricane. If you look at the landing gear as well, the landing gear was suspended from the very strong wing root, had a disadvantage in as much as it gave a very narrow track. So it wasn't quite as stable on the ground as the Hurricane was, but nevertheless, it retracted into the wing and into that large area back there, and that allowed the airplane to be very lightweight and very efficient. So here in March of 1936, we see the prototype Spitfire 5054 and that semi-elliptic wing out there, and that thing flew. Here's a picture of the first flight, very short first flight, 8 minutes to be precise. And this was done at Eastleigh at the Supermarine factory. And the guy getting in there is Mutt Summers, who was then the chief test pilot of Vickers. And Mutt went up, flew it for a very short time, came down and made one of the most misinterpreted comments ever made by a test pilot, which he said, "I don't want anything changing." Well, he needed certain things changing, but there was no fundamental problem with that airplane's performance. And if you look at the airplane throughout its life, all 24 marks of this airplane never had a major design change made to it for anything other than operational expediency. Nevertheless, here's a picture of Mutt Summers is here on the left, and then to him is a guy called Agony Payne, and I should explain where Agony Payne came from. Sir Robert McLean realized that R.J. Mitchell was overworking himself, specifically before he passed away, and he decided he needed help, and he co-opted help from the main Vickers company in the shape of Barnes Wallis, the geodetic structure man and the bouncing bomb man. And when he walked through the door, he and Mitchell did not get on well, to the point where Mitchell went along to McLean and said, "Hey, if Wallis is going to come in, I'm going out." And Wallis was sent back to his office after a while, and Major Payne, known as Agony throughout the industry, came back as help for R.J. Mitchell. You see Mitchell sitting there on the running board of the car. And then Scott Hall at the back, he was the resident technical officer who was assigned to the Spitfire program from the Air Ministry. And then on the right, you see the guy who really played a major role as test pilot of all the Spitfires from the beginning to the end, Jeffrey Quill. And so that was really the start of what was going on. And here you see a Mark I Spitfire, one big radiator on the right, and then the oil cooler on the left. Later on, you see the Mark IXs coming along with two big radiators underneath to take care of the cooling of the bigger power plant. And the first production Mark Is were sent to 19 Squadron at Duxford. And quite a story about that one, because the guy who was sent to pick the airplane up didn't realize that at the Supermarine plant there was a church right on the edge of the airfield, and there was a flagpole next to it, so that if you saw the flagpole up there, you didn't run engines up to high power. But when the airplane delivered, it was taxied over there, and there was a cremation going on. And they didn't, the guys who went out there, the pilot and the guys who went with him to give him last minute instructions, didn't see the flag. And they ran the engine up to full power and checked the mag drop and the whole bit. And they've often wondered since then who it was poised between heaven and earth, not able to go anywhere because of the noise. Anyway, that airplane got delivered, and it was obvious right from the off that it needed some form of variable pitch propellers so that they could better match performance in flight and performance for takeoff and landing. And Rotol, which was a company formed between Rolls-Royce and Bristol, who were the two big engine people at the time, two of the big engine people, and de Havilland, they put together variable pitch and constant speed propellers that were then fitted as the airplanes got into service. And they put armor in the airplanes too to protect the pilots. And although the Mark II airplane came along in June of 1940, the Mark I was the airplane that really took the bulk of the heat for the Battle of Britain. Here you see a chart that just shows the difference between the Mark I Spit and the Mark I Hurricane. Hurricane a little bit slower, less horsepower developed at altitude, about the same speed at sea level, slightly lower. And then, as you see there, the speed does increase as you go to altitude. That's the effect of the supercharger. And so the two airplanes were quite comparable. However, the Hurricane was the slower of the two and was used during the Battle of Britain for really getting at the invading bombers. And the Spitfires were used at more high altitudes for taking on the fighter escorts. Here you see a comparison of sizes and ceilings and weights and whatever. Again, quite similar airplanes, but nevertheless, Hurricane again, better suited to lower altitude stuff. Here's some of the climb performance here. You see the time to the operational ceiling was quite long, but on the other hand, they were quite comparable. But the rate of climb was quite different at 25,000 feet. And that meant that the Spitfires could get up faster to intercept incoming raids that had fighter escorts with them. Here was the situation at the beginning of the Battle of Britain. There were 32 squadrons of Hurricanes and about 19 of Spitfires. So about 70% of the airplanes that fought the Battle of Britain were Hurricanes. There was a breakdown underneath here of the different groups. 10 group was the group that covered the west of England. 11 group was southeast of London, or east and southeast of London. And that was the group that took the majority of the fight in the early part of the Battle of Britain. That was supported by 12 Group that was based out of Duxford, just north of there, that covered the Midlands and the North, and then 13 Group that covered way up north, Scotland and the like. So there you see the kind of breakdown that came on. One last thing to understand about both the Hurricane and the Spitfire, that was one of the really significant weapons that was used to win the Battle of Britain, and that was 100-octane fuel. General Motors had been assigned responsibility to find out why it was that at high compression ratios, the 87 octane, 84 and 87 octane fuels that were available from the refineries, why they created something called pinking or knock, if you will. This was a problem with engines, and you'll notice all the engines that were involved in the beginning, that time period of airplane development, all had a compression ratio of no higher than 6:1 for a basic engine. Anything higher than that, and you get problems with the fuel knocking and with the resultant loss in performance. By the development that was done primarily at General Motors and then later on in England, the tetraethyl lead was added to gasoline fuel, and that allowed it to go to higher compression ratios. And that really was the secret to being able to supercharge the Merlin engines, primarily both on Hurricanes and Spitfires, and allow them to perform as well as they did at much higher altitudes. And that was one of the major contributions that was made right at the beginning of the Battle of Britain. And this was, remember, it was 2.5 years before the United States got involved. But that was one of the early contributions that the United States made to the Battle of Britain. Here's Charles Kettering. He was the guy who was assigned at General Motors to figure that out. He was the research chief. Tom Midgley was his lead mechanical engineer and chemist there. He was the guy who came up with the tetraethyl lead and would fool around with this stuff. He'd wash his hands in TEL and leaded fuel, and died an early death of lead poisoning, I'm afraid. But and there's the English guy, Harry Ricardo. And Ricardo it was who built the compression engine that would be able to measure how much improvement they got and what compression ratios they could go to in these engines using gasoline fuels. And okay, there's the result, the Hurricane and the Spitfire. And as one of the beneficiaries of what they did, I'm certainly grateful for that whole early development. So normally we'd have questions at this time. And I don't know whether we're going to invite questions to be sent into Historic Flight, but we'll leave that to the office staff to figure out. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has entertained you a little bit in your confinement. And with that, we'll sign off. Thanks a lot for being here.